is Swaran Singh, who is a professor of international relations at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Great to have you here with us on TRT World. Why is Putin visiting Vietnam now?
Simple answer to this visit is to showcase that while the entire West is virtually boycotting President Putin and Russia, he wants to showcase he still has friends, particularly in the East, in that sense. The visit to North Korea, of course, could be on expected lines because they have met earlier. Putin had gone there in 2000. Then, of course, Kim Jong-un has visited Russia. But visit to Vietnam perhaps is more interesting because Vietnam is relatively much influential player in the region. It's also rising economy, in that sense, having a foreign trade with both United States and China, 100 billion plus. Actually, 175 billion with China and 124 billion, as Euro said, with United States. In that sense, the trade between Russia and Vietnam is very small, about $3 billion. But the defense cooperation and the historical loyalties towards each other. I think that makes this visit particularly significant. And we remember that Vietnam also supposed to join Quad in some sense in terms of Quad Plus. So visit to Vietnam, I think, is a much more important visit as far as President Putin's defying that isolation is concerned.
Okay, Professor, if I may, I mean, there must be something in it for Vietnam too, right? I mean, why would Vietnam risk its relationship with the West by inviting Putin for nothing? So, what do you think what do you think there is for Vietnam in this?
I think answer to that question probably comes from India as well. I think India is a good example to showcase why Vietnam would still be engaging Russia. Historically, Russia has been a very strong supporter and backbone for Vietnam, whether it was from 1950s to mid 70s when US and France were attacking Vietnam at that time, and of course Russia was the first to recognize Ho Chi Minh government. But again, later, even when in 1978, Vietnam attacked Cambodia. 1979, China had war with Vietnam. Soviet Union always stood by Vietnam all this time, and of course, Vietnam also now advocates its bamboo policy, which shows agility to cooperate with as many countries as possible. Just like India is now trying to cooperate with as many countries as possible, is friend of United States, but also friend of Russia in that sense. That explains why Vietnam wants to sustain that autonomy in its foreign policy and not being seen as bandwagoning any of the big powers, be it United States or any other power. So I think it's also part of Vietnam's assertion of its autonomy in foreign policy. And I think this is going to be increasingly acceptable to Western countries because Vietnam is a very important partner for Western nations as well. But Vietnam wants to underline the fact that they have very strong military cooperation with Russia and increasingly also energy. All the explorations in South China Sea that Vietnam is doing is using various expertise and companies from Russia. So Vietnam has its own reasons to engage President Putin in that sense. But I think in that sense, if you have to choose between two sides, it's partly Vietnam's favor to host President Putin at this difficult time.
Right, and Professor, another reason why Vietnam is a bit different from North Korea when it comes to President Putin's tour of the region is because North Korea and Russia, they're among the most sanctioned countries in the world. So I think it's fair to assume that North Korean leader does not, he's not really concerned about what the West thinks of Putin's visit to his country. But Vietnam has good ties with the West. So I wonder, how do you think the White House specifically is going to look at this visit?
I think White House has already responded. The local mission in Hanoi, US mission, has already made statements which are asking for caution in engaging President Putin, in that sense indirectly supporting his operations in Ukraine. So United States has made that this more than clear that they are not really pleased with the fact that Hanoi is hosting President Putin. But that is for Hanoi to decide, and Hanoi has clearly reflected on these various sentiments that come from United States and still decided to go ahead and host President Putin, which is, I think, fundamentally an assertion that Vietnam is not bandwagoning United States. Vietnam is strong enough today by itself, and because it is emerging very rapidly in terms of economic relation with the United States. Overall, its strategic location is very important. I mentioned Quad Plus is thinking of Vietnam being one of the potential members in United States-led Quad for stabilizing the whole region. So Vietnam understands its importance to Western nations and United States, and therefore doesn't want to kind of look like just simply following the diktats of United States. And this is one way of showcasing that it can assert its own independence of foreign policy and want to underline the historical loyalties and close relations where in very difficult times Soviet Union has stood by Vietnam. And of course the whole tradition of a large number of senior elite in Vietnam constitutes of people who were educated in Soviet Union, many of them in Ukraine also in that sense. So just like on Ukraine also, they are continuously supplying aids, humanitarian assistance, etc. It's fundamentally showcasing Vietnam's assertion of independence of foreign policy.
Professor Sawaran Singh, thanks very much for talking to us here on TRT World. I really appreciate your taking out the time.